In the sweltering summer of 1942, as the world was consumed by the fires of global war, a shadow loomed over the Soviet Far East, a region often overlooked in the grand narratives of World War II. Vladivostok, the vital port at the tip of the Soviet Pacific coastline, was more than just a strategic hub. It was the lifeline connecting the USSR to Allied supplies from across the Pacific. Few outside the intelligence community realized the depth of concern that Allied planners harbored over a hypothetical Japanese advance into this territory. Reports from British and American intelligence suggested that the Imperial Japanese Army, emboldened by its successes in China and Southeast Asia, might consider a push into the Soviet Far East, threatening to open a devastating two-front scenario that could cripple the Red Army's eastern defenses. In Moscow, Soviet General Kirill Meretskov, commander of the Far Eastern Front, quietly reviewed reconnaissance reports, noting unusual troop movements near the Manchurian border. The 1st Red Banner Army and the 5th Rifle Division were placed on heightened alert, their positions along the Ashuri and Amur rivers fortified with hastily constructed bunkers and anti-tank obstacles. Despite the visible precautions, the human toll was already mounting. Supply lines were stretched thin, communications were fragmented by distance and infrastructure limitations, and troops often faced extreme summer heat that turned the dense forests and wetlands into treacherous terrain. The psychological strain on soldiers and officers alike was palpable, a tension amplified by the knowledge that the Japanese Guandong Army had perfected the art of swift, unpredictable assaults in Manchuria. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, US and UK intelligence analysts pored over intercepted Japanese transmissions. Cryptographers in Washington and London had managed to decode fragments of military messages suggesting a possible offensive plan, though the specifics remained tantalizingly elusive. One intercepted note referenced Operation Koryo, a codename whose meaning sparked debate in Allied circles. "We cannot underestimate the resolve or ingenuity of the Japanese in the Far East," warned a memo from the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, in Delhi. The memo underscored the sense of urgency. The fall of Vladivostok could force the Soviets to divert critical resources from a European front, a scenario that could tip the balance in favor of Axis powers in both theaters. The tension reached the corridors of the Allied command in late July 1942, when reports suggested that Japanese reconnaissance patrols had crossed lightly defended sections of the border near Ashurisk. The Soviet Far Eastern Army units conducted counter-reconnaissance maneuvers, often clashing in brief, unreported skirmishes. Yet, no large-scale offensive had materialized, leaving commanders frustrated and wary. Was this a prelude to a major invasion, or merely probing exercises designed to test Soviet defenses? The uncertainty gnawed at decision-makers, fueling both strategic innovation and paranoia. Amidst the military calculations, the human dimension added layers of complexity. Soldiers on both sides endured exhausting marches through dense forests and marshlands, often with inadequate rations and unreliable communication. Diaries from Soviet officers reveal nights spent listening to distant gunfire, unsure whether these were actual attacks or false alarms. "We wait, and the waiting itself is the enemy," wrote Lieutenant Ivan Kovalev of the 5th Rifle Division on July 30, 1942. That simple sentence captured the gnawing anxiety of a theater of war where visibility was limited, and every sound carried the potential for danger. By August, intelligence from OSS operatives based in the Pacific began to paint a slightly clearer, though still fragmentary, picture. Reports hinted at Japanese coordination with naval units stationed in the Sea of Japan, raising the possibility of amphibious maneuvers that could cut off Vladivostok from the south. The Allied response involved frantic planning. What if the Soviets needed reinforcement? Could US or British forces provide limited support without provoking a broader conflict with Japan? Each scenario was weighed, discarded, and revised in a cycle of meticulous preparation. As the summer wore on, Vladivostok itself remained a bustling yet tense city. Ships continued to arrive from the Pacific, bringing supplies desperately needed by the Red Army. Civilians carried on with daily life, aware of distant rumors but largely shielded from the strategic calculations of generals and intelligence officers. Yet, beneath the surface, every reconnaissance report, every intercepted transmission, and every minor border clash contributed to a growing sense of uncertainty. The threat of a Japanese seizure of Vladivostok hung like a cloud, shaping military decisions and everyday lives alike. By the end of August 1942, the stage was set for a high-stakes contest of strategy, courage, and intelligence. The Soviets fortified their positions along the far eastern frontier, Japanese forces conducted careful observation, and Allied analysts anxiously pieced together incomplete information from thousands of miles away. The unanswered question remained: would Japan commit to a full-scale attack, or was this a complex game of posturing and reconnaissance? The answer, still shrouded in mystery, would shape the fate of the Far East, and perhaps the broader course of the war itself. By late 1942, the tension along the Soviet Far Eastern frontier had escalated from whispered fears to tangible military maneuvers. Japanese reconnaissance units from the Guangdong Army began probing deeper into the borderlands of Primorsky Krai, testing the vigilance of the Soviet 1st Red Banner Army and elements of the 5th Rifle Division. Their incursions, though limited in scale, were precise. Small patrols moving under cover of night, using intelligence gathered from local informants and aerial reconnaissance. These operations were designed to assess Soviet defensive positions, revealing weaknesses in supply lines, communication networks, and troop deployment. Even minor skirmishes left unanswered questions about Japan's broader intentions, fueling a quiet panic among Allied strategists in London, Washington, and Delhi. Soviet commanders, acutely aware of the stakes, scrambled to fortify positions around Khabarovsk and along the Amur River. The 59th Rifle Corps established a network of anti-tank ditches and field fortifications, while elements of the 79th Tank Brigade conducted patrols designed to intercept Japanese reconnaissance teams. Despite these efforts, Soviet intelligence struggled to interpret the limited information available. Diaries from frontline officers detail the uncertainty that plagued them. Every shadow, every crack of a branch could mean an attack, wrote Captain Mikhail Petrov of the 5th Rifle Division on October 3, 1942. Such entries reveal the mental strain that often exceeded physical exhaustion, illustrating how psychological warfare, whether intentional or incidental, played a decisive role in the Far Eastern theater. Across the Pacific, British intelligence officers stationed in India monitored intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, piecing together fragments that hinted at coordination with naval forces along the Sea of Japan. The SOE in Delhi prepared contingency reports outlining potential Japanese advances, emphasizing the vulnerability of Vladivostok as a port critical to Allied logistics. Meanwhile, American cryptographers at the OSS headquarters in Washington worked tirelessly to decrypt coded messages, identifying references to Koryo Advance and troop movements into Manchuria. While the full significance of these codenames remained elusive, analysts feared they were the precursors to a larger offensive aimed at striking the Soviet Far East from multiple directions. Amid this intelligence struggle, both sides engaged in a delicate dance of observation and counter-observation. Soviet border patrols often stumbled upon abandoned Japanese equipment or signs of temporary encampments, only to find that Japanese units had vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Such encounters, though minor in casualties, left lingering questions about the scale and timing of a potential attack. "Their shadow is everywhere but nowhere at once," noted Lieutenant Yuri Sokolov of the 1st Red Banner Army, capturing the unnerving ambiguity that dominated these border operations. Every patrol report, every intercepted signal, was a puzzle piece in a mosaic that remained frustratingly incomplete. The human cost of vigilance was significant. Soldiers endured the harsh winter-like conditions that began to creep in even during late fall, battling deep mud, dense forests, and sudden river floods. Limited rations and sporadic medical support compounded the challenge, and morale often fluctuated between anxious anticipation and resigned determination. Yet, despite these difficulties, the Soviet Far Eastern forces maintained discipline, conducting regular drills, reconnaissance patrols, and simulated defensive exercises. Their efforts were mirrored by Japanese units, whose reconnaissance patrols were equally methodical, emphasizing stealth and surprise over brute force. By December 1942, Allied observers began to speculate that Japan's intentions might not be a straightforward territorial conquest but rather a sophisticated campaign of probing and psychological pressure. Reports from the OSS suggested small-scale sabotage attempts and reconnaissance along the Trans-Siberian Railway, hinting at Japanese interest in disrupting Soviet supply and communication lines rather than immediate occupation. British intelligence concurred, warning in a classified report that Vladivostok might become the focal point of a multi-layered operation, potentially involving both land and naval components. The ambiguity of Japanese strategy left military planners across continents on edge, crafting contingencies for a threat that could materialize in any form. As 1943 approached, the Far Eastern theater was a crucible of tension, marked by small but telling encounters that hinted at a larger, unresolved puzzle. Soviet units fortified positions, Japanese patrols vanished as mysteriously as they appeared, and Allied analysts debated the plausibility of a full-scale invasion. Every move was scrutinized, every silence interpreted as potential deception. The stage was set for a confrontation of intelligence, strategy, and human endurance, a struggle in which the outcome remained uncertain and the full scale of Japanese ambition was yet to be revealed. The next phase, analysts feared, could expose weaknesses in the Soviet defenses with consequences that might ripple across both the Pacific and European theaters. The early months of 1943 marked a critical escalation in the intelligence war over Vladivostok. As Japanese reconnaissance continued its shadowy incursions along the Primorsky Krai borders, Allied planners sought to gain clearer insight into the threat. The United States Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, launched a daring covert operation aimed at infiltrating the port city itself. Using disguised fishing vessels to navigate the treacherous currents of the Sea of Japan, small OSS teams attempted to observe Japanese troop concentrations and report back on the movements of the Guangdong Army. The operation was fraught with risk. Soviet coastal defenses, Japanese patrols, and the unpredictable storms of the region combined to make each night-long journey a test of endurance, courage, and luck. Inside Vladivostok, tension was tangible even among civilians. The port teemed with activity as ships loaded and unloaded supplies for the Soviet Far Eastern Front. Yet beneath the apparent normalcy, rumors circulated of unusual troop movements and strange disappearances along the outskirts of the city. Local fishermen reported encountering unmarked vessels that vanished into fog-laden waters, while railway workers along the Trans-Siberian line observed unexpected shifts in military transport schedules. These incidents, though small, created a sense of unease. Officers in the 5th Rifle Division whispered of ghost patrols that seemed to scout the land only to leave no trace. The mystery, compounded by the lack of concrete intelligence, kept Soviet and Allied planners in a constant state of vigilance. Reports from the OSS further heightened the suspense. Teams returning from reconnaissance noted Japanese fortifications near the coastal cliffs outside Vladivostok, including camouflaged machine gun nests and observation posts positioned to cover the approaches to the port. Maps drawn by the agents detailed unusual supply caches and suspected landing points, suggesting the Japanese were considering amphibious operations. While these discoveries stopped short of confirming an imminent attack, the implications were alarming. Analysts in Washington debated the plausibility of a combined Japanese land and naval strike, weighing the limited transport resources against the enormous strategic gains of controlling Vladivostok. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence remained both cautious and frustrated. The Far Eastern Front received fragmented reports from forward units and local partisans, indicating that some Japanese units may have already crossed minor border checkpoints, only to vanish before confrontation. Such episodes fueled rumors of reconnaissance missions by special units, raising questions about Japan's true intent. Was this preparation for an invasion, or simply psychological warfare to tie down Soviet forces? Diaries from officers reveal a constant undercurrent of suspicion. Lieutenant Anatoly Morozov wrote, "The enemy is a shadow we chase, yet we never catch. Each sign of his presence leaves us more uncertain than before." The sentiment encapsulated the tense, almost detective-like nature of Far Eastern warfare in 1943. The human dimension of this clandestine intelligence work cannot be understated. OSS operatives operated in isolation, often for weeks at a time, navigating enemy territory while facing the constant threat of exposure. Many carried small arms, maps, and encrypted radio equipment, but their survival depended equally on skill, nerve, and the cooperation of sympathetic locals. The risk of capture was omnipresent. Japanese forces had a reputation for ruthless treatment of spies, and Soviet authorities were equally suspicious of foreign operatives in their territory. Despite these dangers, the intelligence gathered proved invaluable, revealing fortifications, troop patterns, and logistical arrangements that would otherwise have remained hidden. As spring approached in early 1943, the puzzle of Japanese intentions remained frustratingly incomplete. Reports from OSS agents hinted at a methodical buildup, yet no full-scale offensive had commenced. The Soviets continued fortifying Vladivostok, constructing bunkers and improving coastal artillery placements, while Japanese reconnaissance remained elusive, appearing only when least expected and disappearing without trace. Each intercepted communication suggested multiple possibilities, leaving commanders and analysts grappling with questions that might never be fully answered. Was Japan preparing for an actual assault, or were these maneuvers intended purely as pressure to manipulate Soviet troop allocations elsewhere? The stage was set for a new phase of tension. Vladivostok remained a critical prize, the focus of covert espionage, and the site of subtle confrontations between the Far Eastern Front and the invisible hand of Japanese reconnaissance. The mysterious patrols, unconfirmed skirmishes, and disappearing operatives created a cloak of uncertainty, forcing both Soviet commanders and Allied planners to prepare for a confrontation whose scale and timing were unknown. With every passing week, the suspense deepened, leaving the question of Japan's true intentions dangling over the Soviet Far East like a storm cloud ready to burst. By the spring of 1943, the potential threat to Vladivostok had grown from whispers and shadowy reports into a full-scale exercise in strategic uncertainty. Japanese forces, notably elements of the 23rd and 36th Infantry Divisions of the Guangdong Army, were reportedly massing along the northern coast of the Sea of Japan, their movements carefully monitored by Soviet aerial reconnaissance and partisan informants. The Soviets responded by fortifying key positions. The 59th Rifle Corps expanded its trench networks, while coastal batteries equipped with 152 mm artillery were repositioned to cover likely landing zones. Military engineers worked feverishly to strengthen existing fortifications, building barricades, anti-tank ditches, and observation posts in terrain that could quickly turn into a killing ground for any invading force. Meanwhile, US and UK naval strategists analyzed the feasibility of supporting Soviet defenses indirectly. Submarines stationed off the Japanese coast and supply vessels moving through the Pacific were considered for limited diversionary operations, aimed at stretching Japanese attention without provoking an outright confrontation. In London, the Admiralty debated whether a naval strike against Japanese staging points in northern Korea could slow or disrupt the Guangdong Army's operations. Classified reports described the plan as high risk, potentially high reward, emphasizing the delicate balance of intervention in a theater far removed from Europe but pivotal to global Allied strategy. Within Vladivostok itself, tension was palpable. Civilians witnessed a flurry of construction and troop movements, yet official communications remained vague. Rumors of sabotage and espionage circulated, railway workers reported unaccounted cargo shifts, and local fishermen noted unexplained naval maneuvers in the harbor. Soviet officers, aware of the stakes, conducted drills designed to simulate Japanese amphibious landings, while sniper and reconnaissance teams patrolled the surrounding forests. The psychological strain mirrored that of the previous winter. Every shadow, every unexpected sound, heightened the sense of imminent danger. Adding to the intrigue were reports suggesting coordination between Japanese land and naval units. Intelligence from OSS operatives hinted at a potential landing scenario designed to cut off Vladivostok from reinforcements via the Sea of Japan, effectively isolating the city and forcing a Soviet defensive collapse. Soviet commanders reviewed contingency plans with mounting urgency, allocating divisions along probable landing routes and securing critical bridges and rail junctions. Engineers and artillery units worked in tandem to ensure rapid response to any amphibious assault. The meticulous preparation highlighted the stakes. A Japanese seizure of Vladivostok would not only disrupt supply lines but could also trigger a two-front collapse in the east, forcing the Soviet Union to divert forces from a European front at the worst possible moment. Amid these preparations, uncertainty persisted regarding Japan's actual intentions. OSS reports included cryptic references to internal collaborators and sabotage points, suggesting that the Japanese might attempt to exploit local discontent or clandestine operatives to weaken Soviet defenses. Whether these reports reflected genuine plans or were the result of misinterpreted intelligence remained unclear. Soviet counterintelligence, led by NKVD operatives in Vladivostok, intensified surveillance, rounding up suspected collaborators and reinforcing security in strategic locations. This invisible game of cat and mouse underscored the complexity of the theater. It was not simply a battle of armies but a struggle between information, deception, and anticipation. The human element of these operations was as demanding as the strategic calculations. Soldiers and engineers labored under the looming threat of attack, enduring long hours and harsh conditions in dense forests, wetlands, and coastal cliffs. Morale varied, buoyed by disciplined leadership but challenged by the pervasive uncertainty of the Japanese threat. Officers like Lieutenant Colonel Pavel Vasilyev documented their daily routines in diaries, noting how even minor anomalies, an uncharted trail or an unfamiliar patrol, could trigger hours of investigation. "We prepare for ghosts we cannot see," he wrote in late March 1943, capturing the mixture of vigilance, anxiety, and frustration that defined the Soviet Far Eastern experience. By May 1943, the situation reached a critical juncture. Japanese forces maintained a steady presence along the border, Soviet defenses were fortified, and Allied planners continued to monitor developments from thousands of miles away. The interplay of intelligence, counterintelligence, and troop deployments created a theater in which the smallest move could have monumental consequences. Yet, despite the meticulous preparations and the mounting tension, the question remained unresolved. Would the Japanese launch a full-scale assault on Vladivostok, or were their maneuvers a carefully calculated bluff to stretch Soviet resources? The answer, still shrouded in uncertainty, set the stage for the most suspenseful and mysterious phase of the conflict, a confrontation in which both action and inaction could determine the fate of the Far East. By mid-1943, the strategic anxiety surrounding Vladivostok had reached its peak. Soviet commanders faced a dual threat: the visible presence of Japanese units massing along the northern coastlines and the intangible danger of internal sabotage that could compromise critical supply routes. The 1st Red Banner Army, alongside the 5th Rifle Division, had fortified river crossings along the Ashuri and Amur rivers, established new anti-tank and artillery positions, and deployed reconnaissance units to monitor every approach to the port. Yet, despite these extensive measures, every day brought new intelligence suggesting Japanese movements that were both methodical and cryptic, leaving commanders uncertain of the enemy's ultimate objective. Intelligence reports, particularly from OSS and British SOE operatives, hinted at a calculated Japanese buildup that could precede a decisive strike. Intercepted communications suggested troop rotations, construction of supply depots in hidden valleys, and the possible movement of engineer units capable of rapid bridge construction for armored assaults. Yet there was no concrete confirmation of a planned invasion. The nature of these reports bred a tense atmosphere. Soviet officers could anticipate a sudden attack, but they could not predict its scale or timing. Diaries from the period revealed a strain of constant vigilance. Captain Nikolai Ivanov wrote on June 12, 1943, "We prepare for an enemy who may strike tomorrow, or next month. Every shadow is a question we cannot answer." Simultaneously, Vladivostok itself became a hub of covert activity. Soviet counterintelligence intensified inspections of the railways, docks, and civilian movements, while local intelligence agents reported unexplained arrivals of small Japanese vessels along the coastline. OSS reconnaissance teams reported signs of hidden fortifications, suspicious signaling along riverbanks, and minor skirmishes in which Japanese patrols appeared briefly, only to disappear before Soviet reinforcements could engage. The report suggested a highly mobile and disciplined force, one that relied on stealth and observation rather than direct confrontation. Each finding deepened the mystery, leaving planners to question whether Japan intended to seize Vladivostok outright or simply to weaken Soviet defenses through psychological pressure. The human dimension of this prolonged suspense was severe. Soldiers and engineers labored tirelessly under exhausting conditions, while civilians carried on amidst an invisible war of reconnaissance and counter-reconnaissance. Morale was a fragile construct. Some were inspired by the disciplined fortifications, while others were paralyzed by the uncertainty of what the next day might bring. Letters from officers at the time described nights filled with tension. The sound of distant gunfire, the shadow of an unknown patrol, or even a sudden gust of wind through the trees could spark hours of anxious speculation. These moments exemplified the psychological weight of a conflict defined as much by what could happen as by what had already occurred. As summer advanced, the Soviet command developed contingency plans to respond to any form of Japanese attack. Troops were rotated to maintain alertness, artillery positions were camouflaged, and engineers worked to ensure rapid mobility along secondary roads and river crossings. Special reconnaissance units, including NKVD operatives, patrolled the surrounding forests and coastal areas to detect sabotage or infiltration. The combination of defensive preparation and intelligence gathering created a layered defensive strategy, designed to anticipate both overt assaults and subtle disruptions, and underscored the multidimensional nature of warfare in the Far East. Yet despite the exhaustive planning and continuous surveillance, the nature of the Japanese threat remained elusive. Reports of troop concentrations and minor incursions suggested a potential offensive, but the scale and timing were unclear. Allied observers in Washington and London debated whether Japan's restraint indicated logistical limitations, strategic prudence, or perhaps covert diplomatic considerations. The ambiguity forced both Soviet and Allied planners to maintain a state of perpetual readiness, aware that the first move might come without warning and with catastrophic consequences. By late July 1943, Vladivostok's fate hung in the balance. Its defenders were fortified, its streets alive with military vigilance, and its harbor a network of guarded channels and observation points. Yet the question of Japanese intent remained unresolved, the shadow of a possible two-front collapse looming over every decision. The months of suspense had revealed vulnerabilities, tested resolve, and highlighted the complex interplay of intelligence, strategy, and human endurance. The city waited, a fortress poised on the edge of uncertainty, with every soldier and strategist bracing for a confrontation that may, or may not, come. The tension was palpable, leaving historians and military planners alike to wonder. Was Japan truly planning an assault, or had Vladivostok narrowly escaped a test of will and deception? As 1943 drew into its final months, Vladivostok remained a city fortified, vigilant, and quietly tense. Despite months of Japanese reconnaissance, probing patrols, and ambiguous intelligence reports, no full-scale attack had materialized. The Soviet Far Eastern Front, under General Kirill Meretskov, maintained heightened readiness, with the 1st Red Banner Army and supporting divisions deployed strategically along key river lines, fortified urban sectors, and the coastal approaches to the port. Yet, the months of anticipation had taken their toll. Supply lines were strained, troops were fatigued, and uncertainty weighed heavily on both soldiers and commanders. The psychological shadow of an invasion that never came was nearly as consuming as the threat itself. Across the Sea of Japan, Japanese forces appeared to have withdrawn much of their forward reconnaissance, maintaining a posture that was cautious yet disciplined. Military historians have debated why the Guangdong Army refrained from committing to a decisive strike. Some point to logistical limitations, with the vast distances and harsh terrain of the Russian Far East creating operational constraints for mechanized units and supply chains. Others speculate that Japanese command, already engaged in critical campaigns in China and the Pacific Islands, made a calculated decision to avoid a high-risk confrontation with the Soviets. Allied intelligence reports from the OSS and SOE suggested that covert operations and feints had successfully convinced Japanese planners that any attempt to seize Vladivostok would be met with overwhelming resistance, creating a stalemate of strategy rather than combat. The months of suspense, however, were not without consequence. Vladivostok had emerged as a crucible of military innovation, intelligence operations, and human endurance. Soviet forces had refined rapid response strategies, improved fortifications, and trained soldiers for scenarios that, while never realized, mirrored the high stakes of modern combined arms warfare. OSS and British operatives gained invaluable experience in covert reconnaissance, code-breaking, and the interpretation of fragmented intelligence in hostile territories. In hindsight, these months became a laboratory for wartime adaptation, revealing lessons in logistics, coordination, and psychological resilience that would echo in later operations across Europe and the Pacific. Historians continue to debate the unresolved questions surrounding this episode. Why did Japan, poised with trained divisions and reconnaissance data, choose restraint over action? Was it purely logistical, a decision shaped by the constraints of supply and distance? Or did Allied and Soviet intelligence successfully manipulate perceptions, convincing the Japanese that an attack would be too costly? Diaries from Soviet officers reflect the lingering ambiguity. "We prepared for an enemy that never came, yet the lessons remain," wrote Colonel Viktor Sidorov of the 5th Rifle Division in November 1943. Even decades later, the question of intent continues to captivate scholars, illustrating the enduring mystery of Vladivostok's wartime experience. In the city itself, life returned to a cautious rhythm. Civilians resumed daily routines, though awareness of the past month's tension lingered in the streets, in the harbor, and along the forested periphery. Soldiers maintained a presence, fortifications were kept in a state of readiness, and local intelligence networks remained alert, understanding that the threat, while diminished, had never truly vanished. Vladivostok had survived, but the months of suspense had transformed the city into a symbol of resilience, strategic foresight, and the precarious balance of power in the Far East. Ultimately, the Japanese seizure of Vladivostok, a scenario feared to trigger a two-front collapse in the East, remained only a hypothetical what if. Yet the shadow of this unrealized operation shaped decisions, strategies, and intelligence operations across multiple continents. The mystery of Japanese restraint, combined with the detailed Soviet and Allied preparations, left an indelible mark on wartime doctrine. Vladivostok stood intact, but the episode illuminated the razor's edge of strategy, the fog of intelligence, and the human dimensions of anticipation, vigilance, and endurance in the crucible of World War II. The story of this near collapse remains a testament to the interplay of shadowed intent and steadfast preparation, a historical enigma that continues to challenge understanding more than 70 years later.